and of course the lovely overview of the event today. Plenty to look forward to. For those of you who just joined us behind, I have some good news. There are actually lots of empty seats in front, so you don't have to stand at the back. You can come on down and grab some of the seats in front. In fact, some of the tables in front are only half full. So for those of you standing in the back, feel free to come on down and grab a seat. Now we're going to be jumping into our first panel discussion of this morning in just a minute or two. Before that, of course, just a quick Q&A reminder. There's going to be a QR code shown on the screen above right here. You can see the QR code. Can we have the QR code, please? That's right. Can we have the QR code, please, on the screen? Before we introduce the session, you can take out your mobile phones and scan the QR code on the screen. If you can't scan it, you can head on over to the mobile browser and type in the link https://ahaslides.com. Do you have the QR code back there? Oh, there it is. Beautiful. All right, great. Now, you can submit all your questions here you want answered by the speakers. All right, so scan the QR code and you can feel free to fire off all the questions. And of course, a gentle reminder to remain in the ballroom during all our sessions. I know some of you might want to network. There'll be plenty of time to network later on. And now, without further ado, we are going to be jumping right into our first panel discussion. And of course, the question that we're asking our panelists to answer is, how are global asset allocators and investors reading Indonesia's potential? Now, let's welcome our panelists on stage for this interesting discussion. Can you please join me to welcome, first of all, David Harrity, Head of Corporate and Structured Finance, Commercial Banking, HSBC Asia Pacific. And he's joined by Sharon Liang, Principal and Head of Southeast Asia, Siguler, Guff. And of course, also joining us is Pradita Astarina, Venture Partner, Strategic Year Holdings Limited. And we're happy to have with us our moderator. She's Eudora Wang, Deputy Editor, Greater China, DealStreetAsia. And without further ado, everyone's excited to get going. Eudora, I'll hand the time over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a great start to the day. And it's my very, very honor to be with the speakers on stage. We have new speakers. We have returning speaker. Thank you, David. Thank you, Pradita, for joining us for the very first time. And Sharon for being a returning speaker with us. Without further ado, I will let the speakers to briefly introduce themselves. Shall we go Pradita, Sharon, and David, please?
Thanks, Eudora. Hi, everyone. My name is Pradita Astarina. I'm a venture partner of Strategic Year Holding Limited, a growth investment firm that investing 80% in Southeast Asia and 20% in North Asia, covering Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, Greater China areas. And we often invest in the Series B above deals in Southeast Asia and also like the Greater China area.
Thank you very much. Sharon?
Good morning, everybody. Sharon here from Siguler Guff. We are a multi-strategy investment firm with a headquarters in the States, and currently we manage around $20 billion. And we have a very specific focus when we step outside from the States, which is emerging markets. And we always adopt like a customized, tailor-made strategy for each country that we tap into. And for Southeast Asia, our mandate is relatively broad, which include fund-of-fund investments, direct and co-investments. Happy to share more with you guys later. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, Eudora. David Harrity here from HSBC. HSBC should be well known to many people, but I run the financing business for the commercial bank across the region. Spend most of my time in Southeast Asia, India, and Australia, and specifically looking at how we finance startups, new economy companies, and high growth companies across the region.
Thank you. I feel a lot of responsibility having our panel following George's data-heavy keynote speech. So, as promised, we're going to read into the numbers we've seen last year. Just to refresh your memory a little bit, last year was a pretty slow year in terms of startup funding across Southeast Asia. And in Q4 especially marked the lowest quarterly deal volume in over 6 years. And overall throughout the year, the annual tally of number of deals stood at 633 deals across the entire region, down 10.3% from the previous year, and the total deal value plummeted 41.7%. And in Indonesia, the market was quite quiet as well. Funding in this biggest market in this region continues to deteriorate, and equity funding activities fell 33.6% last year compared to the previous year. So I wonder, how are our global asset as allocators reading into this data? David, shall we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Eudora. Look, I think the numbers I'm not going to debate. I think you've explained them in Joji's introduction, was very helpful. But HSBC remains very bullish on Indonesia and Southeast Asia more generally. We think there's a number of really positive macro factors that will drive activity for us, particularly on the financing side, in the coming 12 months. So there's strong growth, particularly in Indonesia. There's a large growing population, despite some of the headwinds probably in the consumer space, but that market does look attractive. And there's various parts of the population that are underserviced and underpenetrated, as we're seeing by some of the work we're doing with our clients. So we think it's a very positive story as we go into 2025, both here in Indonesia, but also across the broader Southeast Asia region.
Sharon, so David gave us a pretty positive view looking into 2025. What's your view? Do you see, after a slow 2024, do you see global investors slowing down their deployment in Indonesia?
Sure. I think we all know that every market is composed of supply and demand, right? And the crossing points have everything to do with prices. So my read is actually pretty straightforward because prices were off, so deals cannot be done. And the more important questions we have to ask ourselves as a participant should be that why those prices were off and how should we fix them? Yeah. And of course, as a global emerging investor, we always hovering around. And definitely Indonesia has always been our priority among all the Southeast Asian countries. And yeah, we believe we'll talk about the structural changes and all the tailwinds. So yes, we are actually in town not only for this, but also to conduct due diligence on some other direct investments we have in the pipeline. So yes, we are here to deploy.
Thank you. And Pradita, you mentioned strategic year, both developed markets and developing markets.
Yes, yes.
Does that...
Okay, I will go back to like our aim to create like the index fund for the passive investments, right? So we have a strong research team behind our back that actively research like the correlation between the developed and developing countries. For the data, S&P 500, for example, in 2024, it grew like 24% year on year, right? Meanwhile, the Indonesian Composite Index is minus 2.65 last year. And then our research team really like mapping all these countries that becoming like our geographical coverage, for example, in North Asia and Southeast Asia, and try to emulate like which one is going up and which one is going down. So when we deploy our dry powder, we try to rebalance the index, our internal index. So to answer your questions, and we are also in Indonesia for the long term. We also believe at the dispersion of the return that for like the privileged and also like the sophisticated investors, they have been through cycle, right? Bullish, bearish, starting in 1998, 2000, when the dot-com bubble burst, right? And then after that, like 2008, when subprime mortgage happening in the USA, and the impact for the Indonesian stock market, even like the IDX halting the trading at the time. And after 2008, and then like we fast forward to like the last crisis, which is like the COVID-19 in 2020, and we do believe that there is like the market will be bullish, bearish, and there will be a cycle that repeated one to another. So yeah, we do believe that the smooth sea never produced the skilled sailor, right? So again, back to like, we are here for the long term to enjoy all the positivity of the Indonesian economic growth. And also we do believe that everything will rebalance at the time. Thank you.
It's great to see confidence from the speakers. And I think last year when we see the start of funding drought as well as IPO market slowdown, partially because it was an election year. So I wonder, David, during our interview in December, you mentioned how HSBC, through its $1 billion ASEAN Growth Fund, already deployed $400 million in this region. Given that the fund was only launched in March, that was pretty impressive. Can you share with us the thinking, the reasons behind such a massive amount of debt financing in this region?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think it kind of signals our intent and our commitment across Southeast Asia and ASEAN to this subset of clients, right? So we launched the ASEAN Growth Fund in March in 2024. We've deployed around $400 million, as Eudora said. And we've seen good traction and good success with a number of companies operating across the region, and that includes Indonesia. I think the purpose of our fund is really targeting those clients that are scaling. So it's scaling across the region. So it's looking at business models where they've got a track record and a proven business model, and then they need access to capital to help them scale, whether it's cross-market or into different client groups. And each of the solutions is quite bespoke in nature. So there's no kind of mechanistic approach to how you can get access to the fund. So we work with companies across the region to provide the solutions. And it's rather than looking at the kind of, whilst they're scaling, they would probably have less access to through the traditional wholesale financing route. So it's looking at specific parts of the businesses that might give us access to a strong asset base or a cash generative part of the business, and structuring a specific solution around that group, and that's had reasonable success. The size of the fund, I think, represents the size of the opportunity. As I say, we're bullish on Indonesia and the broader region. And it also enables us to tailor and taper solutions accordingly. So I think probably the smaller end of the transactions might be kind of $15, $20 million equivalent. And the top end, it's probably near $100 million, depending on, again, what stage the company is in their development. If they're slightly later, it might be slightly bigger, slightly earlier, it might be slightly smaller.
Right, we will delve into the strategies for Sharon and Pradita a bit later, but one more big picture question. Sharon, maybe you can take this one. So after an election year, a lot of people in the market are expecting more stability, at least when it comes to the direction of the regulations. Do you see any structural changes that could potentially happen in Indonesia, influence private market deal making?
Sure, I think the tailwinds are very strong and very obvious. But since the crowd, I will assume that most of you guys are VC investors or VC founders. I think it's a very critical thing to think about, is whether those tailwinds are blowing into startup things, or is actually has nothing to do with startup, right? And I think from our perspective, as I shared, we have a very broad mandate to pretty much cover the whole spectrum of different set of opportunities. So yes, we still feel very bullish, in general.
Pradita, any structural changes that you see?
I think several key observation from my side is that, for example, like after election, right, the investors, especially the foreign investors, would like to see like how the tax, like the new tax system affecting their return, right? The tax, or like, the capital market regulation, how the capital market regulation can change to overcome, like, for example, like several startups would like to have a dual listing in the Indonesian market or in the North Asia market, especially for the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, right? We have been discussed with our portfolio companies as well. And I think the second point is that when we heard about like there is like a news that there will be a new regulation on the family office, for example, in Bali, that will be much more open for the foreign investors. Because for now, why we have the headquarters not in Indonesia, whether in Hong Kong or in Singapore, it's just because the tax system here is not really supportive for our exit. Yeah, so that's 2 points that are really the key observation from my side.
And David, what's your view on this? I think debt financing, perhaps, could you share some insight into the potential direction of fiscal policy in Indonesia and how that will influence the deployment?
Yeah, so I think we will be fairly consistent with our deployment. I think all the factors the panelists have discussed will help foster more, whether it's the supply-demand imbalance or the price point, or whether it's tax incentives. Our deployment's really focused on working with individual companies at the stage of development they're in, so it's quite difficult to give a mechanistic view, Eudora, of what we'll say. Our kind of view is shaped by, we're very bullish on Indonesia and the outlook across Southeast Asia. We have capital set aside and we're getting good traction with companies operating across the region. And despite some of the headwinds around kind of funding and opportunities, the really strong companies are continuing to grow. And we're seeing that from the activity we've seen over the last 9 to 10 months and prior to that.
I want to delve deeper into the deployment plan of global investors here. So Sharon, you cited a number, I think it's most updated, about Siguler Guff. The AUM is $20 billion you mentioned. I saw on the website that you have about $5 billion of AUM for emerging markets platform, including for Asia, and that includes over 80 underlying GPs and 65 direct equity investment. Could you share with us more insights into the percentage allocated for Southeast Asia and specifically Indonesia, if possible?
Sure. Yeah. Southeast Asia has always been our radar. Before I relocated here 2 years ago, it was actually under our Indian team's mandate. So we haven't really deployed or covered a lot of GPs. But that's on my shoulder right now. Yeah, so, and the very interesting thing about our platform is that pretty much all the pockets or pools of capital are global. So we don't really have a specific number for like Southeast Asia per se. But everything is good and bad, right? So, but my takeaway for this kind of like setup or structure will be that my mission critical is just to find the best GP and the highest quality of deals, right? And no matter what, right, we will make it work. Yeah.
For the GPs in the room, I have to ask this question. What's the key yardsticks for you in GP selection, especially in light of the current market environment?
Sure, GPs, right? Okay. May I see a show of hands, like, if you're a VC, please raise your hand? No? Oh, okay. Very few. All right. But I think the most important thing for us when we screen the GPs in Southeast Asia, not only Indonesia, but in Southeast Asia, I think number one thing we look at is always your fund size. How can you deploy a certain amount of fund? And how you plan to deploy? Yeah. Forget about a sector theme or like, please be agnostic as you wish. But I think how you're gonna deploy, how you pace yourself, that's always our number one criteria. And number two is definitely, when I put on my LP hat, right, everybody looks at track record. But nowadays, yes, MOIC, IRR, okay, yeah, we'll look at it. But how you drive exit, how you generate DPI. If you're a VC specifically, how you differentiate your outcome compared to VP guys, right? Yeah. So simply put, these two key criteria. Yeah.
Okay. Feel free if you can't share the specific names, but I'm just out of curiosity, can you specify? Because we did an interview a few months ago with Siguler Guff, and the company mentioned about the hybrid approach of investing in Southeast Asia, and also mentioned the importance of specialist GPs in this market. Can you perhaps give us 1 or 2 examples of the kind of GPs that you're looking to work with or you're considering?
Sure. The hybrid meaning we're gonna do fund of funds, co-investment, direct investment, everything. So And regarding to the sector specialist, yes, I think if we like put everybody on the map of 2x2 diagram, right? We have the regional ones to country-specific ones. We have the sector generalist to the sector specialist. Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting to see more and more sector specialists showing up on radar. But of course, a few like sector themes that we are very enthusiastic or interested about would be like healthcare, B2B, right? I think these two, we're gonna maybe talk about these like a little bit more later regarding to the investment themes. But yes, I think B2B, healthcare, consumer, yes, in general.
Okay, shifting to Pradita. Strategic year, you mentioned several markets that you're looking at for Asia. What type of synergies are you looking to achieve? Especially we see more capital flows cross-border here.
Yeah, so we are also would like to unlock every single value of our portfolio companies. What I mean by value is not only like financial, but also the commercial values itself. And then we are looking to deliver the strong DPI to our LPs. So to mention that the cross-border synergy, we usually do three things. The first one is that, for example, there is like a benchmarking or like lesson or benchmark with the regional startups or like regional companies that have similar business model in North Asia and already listing in NASDAQ or in NYSE to our portfolio company in Southeast Asia. And usually we create the meeting, the founders, and then this more mature companies to share the lessons, right? Who the dons and the do and the don'ts, especially what to avoid in order to really deliver a strong return. And the second one is we are very active to introduce our portfolio companies to for example, the investment banks, for example, to really prepare them for the next stage of their funding. And also if some of the portfolio company would like to have the M&A process, we really look to, the mix and match between the potential target so that we can be able to really, for example, we saw the consolidation between the two startups, right? Or one the conglomerate in Southeast Asia, they would like to acquire a smaller startup to complement their existing business model. We really help our portfolio companies to do that. And the third point is that the unit of economics itself, in terms of the fundamentals, the profitability is very important, not only the growth at all costs. So we are very active in monitoring the unit of economics, and we compare for example, startup in Southeast Asia, how about the contribution margin, the EBITDA level, and all those small things to the comparables in the global market, especially for the companies that have been very successful in the US and other developed market. So that's the three things how we try to unlock value in terms of the financial and commercial side of the portfolio companies in order to unlock the alpha for our LPs.
Thank you. I want to draw your attention to one of the discussion points that Joji mentioned, which is the launch of sovereign wealth fund in Indonesia that is set to raise close to $1 trillion. I wonder, David, what's your view when it comes to new participants coming to the market, becoming more active? How will that influence global investor strategies for Indonesia?
Yeah, look, I think it's a positive, right? And it's part of the positive backdrop here in Indonesia. More generally speaking, high growth, fast growing companies require capital to support their growth. So having the sovereign support is a big statement of intent, I think, for Indonesia and paints a positive picture. From a financing perspective, if I think about what we've done over the last 18 to 24 months across Southeast Asia, there's probably four observations. So first, we launched a few new economy funds across the region. These are really designed to support earlier stage companies get access to bank financing. Typically, working capital, the kind of less glamorous side of financing, but quite often it's well received by companies as they optimize their working capital cycles, preserve cash, and extend cash runways. That's early stage. The second is last year we launched venture debt, and I think venture debt is quite a nascent product in this part of the world, but it's an interesting concept for companies that acquire some more term financing. Again, it can extend cash runways, take them through when they've got a proven business model, probably with recurring revenue, as they can extend that fundraising window. The third is the ASEAN Growth Fund, so the fund I've mentioned earlier, so that was $1 billion. And then the fourth is the more traditional wholesale senior financing route, which is open, as companies mature. So if I reflect back on 2 years ago, we probably only had the fourth option really available for our discussions with companies, whereas now we have all four. So having discussions with the companies, be able to say, well, what stage are you at with your development? How are you thinking about your growth? What's the right kind of solution we can tailor to support your growth? Is a way that HSBC's kind of challenged ourselves to work, I guess, better with the kind of future-orientated companies. So bringing it back to your question, I think the more capital providers we can have in the ecosystem, the more people participating in the ecosystem, the better scenario it is for companies to help reach their ambitions.
Okay, I think I'd love to hear what, Sharon, you have to say when it comes to the LP side, looking at new capital providers in the market. And then maybe we take one question from the audience, the second one. I guess, Pradita, you can take this one, if that's okay. Yeah, so Sharon, from your side, as we see state capital potentially become more active in this market, how do you see challenges for GPs in the market trying to align potentially different LP interests within one fund?
Yeah, I think this kind of setup is quite common in many of other countries or markets, right? And I do respect Indonesian government from the deep down of my heart, just to be honest. And I do believe that they have a very long-term vision regarding to how they're gonna allocate the asset within the country, if not in the region, right? And I think this new setup shows a very strong signal to the world even, that they are open and welcoming the global partners to shake hands. And that's a very, that's something we appreciate as a global investor for sure, yeah. And speaking of the overall VCP ecosystem in the country or in the region, right, I think it's a gradual process for everybody to find their own positioning and place. So just embrace the new changes, I would say, yeah.
Thank you very much. And Pradita, the second question from the audience, how are portfolio managers readjusting their allocation to Southeast Asia given the far higher returns in developed markets?
Right. We have okay, for example, for the generative AI, right? If you look at the S&P 500, the three best performing stocks is like the NVIDIA, Palantir, and Vistra, right? But again, our view for Indonesia and Southeast Asia is for the long term. And based on our statistics, 5 to 7 years, according to our holding period, when we invest in this private market earlier, it's going to be having a better result. So we are very wise with regard to allocating our capital, or whether if we know in the developed countries, for example, it will produce the higher return. Since we are here for the long term, more than 5 years, so we really would like to capture 280 million, the Indonesian, the total population, for example, and then the very stable economic growth, the 5% to 5.5%, right? And then the stable inflation. But for now, unfortunately, our US dollar is already 16.300, right? By today, and we hope the exchange rate will be stabilized so that there will be no more crisis in the future. But we always saying to our portfolio company in Southeast Asia that we need to have to extend our runway, right? We never know what will happen in the future, but as the experienced investor, we already see all the bullish and the bearish market, and then for the bearish market, we always advise our portfolio companies to really look at their unit of economics and then be very mindful with their cash flow, because the cash flow is the king. So rather than taking it as we really lower our allocation, we really learn how to benchmark the similar business model with the developed countries such as Hong Kong and the US market.
Okay, thank you so much. Shifting focus a little bit to sector focus. So our own data, DealStreetAsia's data, show that fintech is one of the bright spots last year, despite of the slowdown in startup funding. David, you focus on fintech and you invested a bunch of companies here. We do have a fintech-focused closing panel later today, but could you share some of the high-level comments as in the opportunity you see here?
Sure, I'll let the experts later give the proper insights. But yeah, look, there are probably a couple of observations on sectors. I think fintech remains very buoyant here in Indonesia and across Southeast Asia. I think consumer, I think e-commerce, education technology, and also healthcare will be key kind of sectors of focus. I don't think I'm sort of letting any cats out of any bags or saying anything new, but I think the kind of macro fundamentals are still there. I think the way I sort of view fintech and the reason why it's still getting a lot of investment and we're seeing a lot of successful companies that we're working with is it's genuine new economy, right? So new economy is a broad term that's bandied around a lot. But the way I kind of look at it is new economy is using technology to service underserved parts of the population or the old economy. And that's what a lot of these companies are doing. So to give a couple of examples, like if I think of supply chain financing, right, and the kind of supply chain finance world, and how MSMEs or SMEs get access to capital to support their growth, often linked with global supply chains, that's largely underserviced. MSMEs, there's a big funding gap here in Indonesia, big funding gap across Southeast Asia. And we're seeing some really interesting businesses develop and emerge of how they're looking at these MSMEs and assessing their creditworthiness and providing access to capital. So, that's why we're really pleased to partner with them on the supply chain. I think another angle is on the consumer side. So looking at how the consumers are getting access to credit. So traditional and more developed markets, it's usually credit card route and things like that. But you look at the penetration here, it's very low. And you combine the kind of access to credit with consumption habits of how people are now consuming, it's really, really interesting. And a lot of companies we're working with are coming up with really unique solutions. And that's why we're keen to work with them, looking at how they're thinking about their credit and their asset portfolios, and then how can we distill down how we assess their credit and work with them to provide access to financing that this is scaling, right? So it's helping them move to maybe the present in one market to another market that has similar characteristics. And that's where we see the real positivity and a couple of probably examples, more generally, where we're seeing activity.
I also want to hear from Sharon and Pradita in terms of some of the most popular industries here in Indonesia. So thinking about consumer sector, thinking about e-commerce. And last year, the funding into these areas was really slow. And we have a lot of headwinds we see in the market, including the VAT regime, the shrinking middle class, and potential adjustment of transaction on e-commerce platforms. So do you see investors? So Sharon, you are industry agnostic, you mentioned, but for a consumer focus or have consumer sector under their mandate, for those investors, do you see them rework their strategy around this area?
I think speaking of all the B2C initiatives, right, we will always focus on the infrastructure level of services. As David mentioned, I think fintech is definitely one, healthcare, education, and speaking of the growing GDP per capita, right, when people enjoy a better lifestyle, what are the maybe top 3 items, no matter it's like product or services, they would like to upgrade for themselves, right? So that's how we screen down what we want to focus on.
Yeah, just would like to add Sharon's opinion, right, about this kind of the consumption upgrade. For Indonesian market, we always remind our portfolio company that we really need to adjust the total addressable market of Indonesia and then tailor our offering to the specific target of the geographies that we would like to enter. For example, the Indonesian total addressable market, we can say 280 million, right? But it's Indonesia is an archipelagic countries that consists of 17K islands, which if you look at the proportion between the Jakarta area and then the other periphery area like Bandung or Surabaya is completely different. So we had a research that the total household spending that, more than 10K or 20K monthly is just a very small compared to India and China, for example. So we really need to be mindful when we define our total addressable market in this case, because for example, for the Java island itself is around 50 million, and 50 million is very diverse in terms of the you know, the purchasing power parity, and then we also know, like, for example, like country in Indonesia, we have like Gini coefficient that can be high. So the one that can afford to buy your product is only concentrated in several big cities in Java Island, which is like Jakarta and perhaps like Surabaya and Bandung. Second point that we always remind our portfolio company is that we need to combine like the online and offline presence. Because like during the COVID-19, everything is online, right? The online platforms is really emerging at that time. But right now, we always see like some of the portfolio company, they do the transition. So they open up, like, for example, like the pilot of the stores in several cities in Jakarta and other cities in Southeast Asia. So we really need to adjust our strategy based on like what happened with the environment. So we need to very adaptive towards that. And the third point is that we really need to monitor all the costs. For example, like how is like the delivery last mile cost, and then compared to like the fulfillment center cost, for example, in order to maximize our infrastructure and supply chain that's supporting our business model.
Thank you very much. That's all the time we have, unfortunately, but I'd like to conclude the panel with one more question for each one of you, so please answer briefly. If you had to narrow down one lesson that you learned in 2024, what works, what doesn't work, what could you share with our audience? Shall we start with David, please?
Thanks, happy to go first. One lesson, regionally, nothing's homogenous. So I enjoy spending time understanding the detail, and I think that's the point that Pradita was making in her last comment, that just looking at the macro set isn't always the right answer. You have to understand the detail of each individual one, and that's what we spend most of our time doing, and that's why we're seeing such traction in our financing solutions across the region. So that's probably my one learning and observation for 24.
Yeah, very brief one. You need to tell what's noise and what's not. And just play your strength to the maximum.
For me, the lesson learned is going back to fundamentals. And like profitability is very important. And then we need to think like the innovative strategies for exit. For example, like secondary listing and then the M&A instead of only focusing on IPO itself.
Thank you so much. If you do have any more questions, please feel free to grab our speakers after the panel. And thank you so much. A round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you so much. And of course, what a great way to start off our panel. Let's have a photo, shall we? Looking fantastic. Big smiles for the camera. One more. And we've got it. What a great way to start our morning.